Good afternoon, everyone. Allow me to warmly welcome you to today's seminar session, the 15th seminar session in the series titled Curriculum Studies in Canada. My name is Ying Ma, UBC Postdoctorate Fellow and Coordinator for this seminar series. I feel very honored to facilitate today's session. Each session will be approximately 1 hour, with speakers allowed around 40 minutes to give their presentations, followed by a short Q&A segment. With the permission of our guest speaker today, we will be recording this seminar session. It will become available on both of our website, curriculumstudiesincanada.ca, and our YouTube channel. Today, we're very happy and very fortunate to have Dr. Veronica Pacini-Ketchabaw from Western University to give us a talk. She will introduce herself to us and then give us a talk titled Education for Worlds to Come. Welcome, Dr. Veronica Pacini-Ketchabaw.
Thank you very much. And let me just start by sharing my screen. And now I want to move from my, okay. All right. I think I'm good. Hello, everyone. Good evening. Nice to see people who I know. Dana, Melanie, Alejandra, and now I can't see who else is there. And thank you, Bill, and for inviting me to participate in this very exciting curriculum studies series. I have the privilege to join you today from the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Atawandarin peoples on lands that are connected to the London Township and Sombra treaties and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. And I do this territorial acknowledgement both as necessary for a project of education that we're going to be talking about, and also in an adequate space, particularly if it's not joined with demands for restitution and reparation. And I want to make, can you actually see the slides okay? Yes, all right, perfect. I want to also begin by acknowledging that although this presentation is a bit of a performance that is contextualized within my intellectual engagement in early childhood curriculum as a complicated conversation to adopt Bill's exact words when reconceptualizing curriculum in the 20th century, it is not necessarily an individual journey. I want to acknowledge my intellectual engagement with my feminist colleagues in the Commonwealths Research Collective, especially my Australian colleagues, Africa Taylor and Mindy Blaze, and as well as my Canadian colleagues in the Early Childhood Pedagogies Network, especially my friend, Cristina Delgado Vintimiglia, with whom I'm very fortunate to think education and pedagogy with. I'll start by beginning, or I will begin with a concern that I have today in early childhood education, which is my field of expertise, and then think through my intellectual trajectory in early childhood curriculum, as I said before. And I will do that specifically through what I call, for lack of another term, four performative acts. And I hope that through these acts, I speak a little bit and indirectly to my concerns. If there is an idea that I want to emphasize today, is the idea that early education needs to be a possibility for transformation of the status quo, for the invention of otherwise worlds, and for rethinking what the human might be. Of course, this is not a new idea in education. Many education theorists have written about this. Bell Hooks, as you can see here in the quote in the introductory chapter of Teaching to Transgress, writes about her experience in an all-Black grade school, and she says that to be changed by ideas was pure pleasure when she was at school, but to learn ideas that ran counter to values and beliefs learned at home was to place oneself at risk, to enter the danger zone. Home was the place where I was forced to conform to someone else's image of who and what I should be. School, she says, was the place where I could forget that self and through ideas reinvent myself. Now, my concern is that perhaps we are at a moment in early childhood education that we have forgotten, we have left behind what Bell Hooks says, that education is a revolution and is a space to invent oneself. So let me speak more specifically about this concern. In 2007, 2008, I participated with many of my colleagues in the development of the first early learning framework in the province of British Columbia, working with the Ministry of Education. I then was peripherally involved in the revision of the framework in 2017 and 2018. At the end, the published framework excluded all the right words like developmental principles, developmental domains, maturation, and so on. And it also included all, and it continues to include all of the correct words and concepts, including pedagogy, post-foundational theories, dialogue, critical reflection, and even pedagogical documentation. It also mentions concepts and ideas that I have been working with my colleagues in the Commonwealths Research Collective for the last decade. And this is Worldpedagogies. And for those that are not familiar with the idea of Commonwealthpedagogies, I'll just say a few words now, but I will return later on in the presentation. For us, Commonwealthpedagogies respond to the paradoxes and profound challenges of the Anthropocene, and for the challenges that the Anthropocene portends for the future of life on Earth as we know it. In other words, for the common worlds that we bequeath to children, using an actively inclusive more than human framework that reassembles worlds by countering the divisive distinction that is often drawn between sociocultural contexts and natural environments. Commonwealthpedagogies resist the epistemological division between society and our culture as distinct from nature that underpins post-Enlightenment Western thinking in early childhood. So in Commonwealthpedagogies, we are concerned with the legacies that children inherit, the dangers of escalating waste, rampant and increasing dirty fossil fuel extraction, devastating extinctions, and everywhere the tragic fallout of climate change. In the framework, Commonwealths is mentioned, as you can see here in the slide. Now, some might say that this is an accomplishment and that it reflects the impact of our scholarship on everyday practice. However, I think that we need to be much more cautious about what might be happening and what I see could be happening. As I engage in conversations with early childhood educators and pedagogists across the province of British Columbia, I observe the ways in which Commonwealthpedagogies are engaged with, and I have become deeply concerned. The concern is that Commonwealth pedagogies are becoming depoliticized. By that, I mean that they are becoming the answer, the solution to our problems. They give practitioners direction for managing and instructing children to be able to achieve predetermined ends. They're used to perpetuate individualism and the guardian of social privilege. They're used interchangeably with nature education and stewardship pedagogies. They are used to position children as investment for future economic productivity. Within the framework, Commonwealth pedagogies are not just misunderstood, but are quickly appropriated with neoliberal aims. Using the words of Bell Hooks, Commonwealth pedagogies might not necessarily be used in counter-hegemonic ways, but used politically to maintain the status quo. Children are not encouraged to reinvent themselves. Rather, Commonwealth pedagogies are merely used to strive to reinforce domination. Of course, this is not, it should not be necessarily a surprise for me and for us in curriculum studies, as Sharon Todd writes, and I quote, on the one hand, pedagogy touches on the hope that people can think differently, can change the way they relate to each other, and can form new understandings of themselves and the world. And on the other hand, the demand for learning to become carries with it a great burden. For if pedagogy is about the becoming of the subject, she says, then it can become a tool for the most oppressive ends. And perhaps the way that what I see in the way that Commonwealth pedagogies are working right now is under an educational paradigm that creates adapted capacities toward individual success. Often early childhood educators quote these pedagogies and draw from theories that are activated and valued within early childhood, like theories from population health, using the EDI, using qualitative evaluations of young children's engagements, self-regulation theories, the neuroscience, scientific theories, social and emotional development around children's adjustments to society. Now, if I ask about what is the child and what is the society that we are trying to create through Commonwealth pedagogies, even though these ideas are often not necessarily thought through and hidden in most of this kind of neoliberal pedagogies, we would say, and this is what the framework says, that we're trying to create strong, competent children in their uniqueness, capable children, self-actualized, well-adjusted within society, a society that works towards individual rights and liberal competencies. And then in the way in which these pedagogies are practiced, the methods that are used are observations of individual children, meeting competencies, activities to keep children occupied, play as something that young children do, and also the management of children through health and guidance. So this specifically is what concerns me. Now, in the rest of the presentation, I'm going to pause there for a minute, so try to create a break. In the rest of the presentation, I want to move through 4 different acts that work through my own trajectory towards Commonwealth pedagogies as a way for me to repoliticize these pedagogies, as a way to tell personal stories that speak of how I see Commonwealth pedagogies in the political realm. So I don't necessarily want these acts to be read or to be heard as to seeking recognition, not as a correct story for Commonwealths pedagogies. In fact, many colleagues in the Commonwealths Collective might have other stories, and I know they do have other stories of how they come to Commonwealth pedagogies. But rather, I do this for the story of the configuration of power and the machinations that put Commonwealthing in a deeply political framing of education. Perhaps we might call this acts, following Foucault, a bit of a history of the present. So, act number 1, schooling and the horrors of state dictatorship. My education took place during the last dictatorship in Argentina between 1976 and 1983. This was a time, as Vicky Bell says, when the military state was routinely kidnapping people from their places of work, from their homes, from the street, from making no place safe, when meetings of more than 2 people on public streets or having the wrong hairstyle or reading the wrong book became sufficient causes of suspicion. The state and the military itself became the moral institution. In the search for the conscious assumption of being Argentine, the preliminary step taken by the ideologists of the dictatorship was to purify or clean the educational system of all human and material elements that would prevent the concession of the launched personalization moralization model. During this period, the educational policy that I learned under outlined everything that was prevented from accessing, everything that was excluded. In particular, any social protest was prohibited and there was no dissent from the status quo. One of the basic objectives of the military coup was to create an educational system in accordance with the needs of the government, which would effectively serve the objectives of the nation and consolidate the values and the cultural aspirations of being Argentine. The desire was to preserve the regime. The educational system became a key place to carry out mainly the symbolic repression and consequently facilitate the validity of those supposed perennial values of the immutable essences of the immutable essences that make up a Western and Christian society. The role of the educational system was to restore essential values, emphasize the sense of morality, integrity, and efficiency that would restore order to a society that, according to the government, had lost its national values. Schools were also about counterinsurgency. So not only in terms of, like Ines Dussel says, from curricular content, but also they became a space for the promotion of informing on suspected subversives and the surveillance of a student and teacher's dissent. Here in the slide is the decree entitled Subversion in the Educational Sphere. Let's meet our enemy, or let's learn about our enemy. There was in which teachers were enlisted to maintain national security and root out the root of subversion. It was not until the time I entered Teachers College in the late 1980s that I became aware of the role of education in a society. Becoming a teacher and an early childhood educator following a brutal dictatorship meant that I was exposed to the strong movement towards community participation and democratization that pervaded education at the time. It also meant that it became crucial for me to ask, as Baker says, questions about the non-neutrality of what is selected to be passed on to future generations. Act number 2, migration and multicultural education. In the 90s, I migrated to Canada to find myself in the position of an immigrant childcare worker. As I entered the field, I encountered how Canada, through its service delivery model, resists the idea of early education as a site for politics and for ethics and politics. As an immigrant, I became interested in studying how early childhood education acts as a zone of governance for racialized young children, enacted through discourses of sensitivity, tolerance, and acceptance of difference that characterize Canadian multiculturalism. Early childhood educators are interviewed, for example, refer to all children needing and wanting the same basic experiences, not recognizing that these basic experiences have been normalized through discourses of whiteness. Assumptions are made about racialized children not having the normal opportunities that all children should have. Racialized children are assumed to need a strong attachment figures, routines, and exposure to a wide range of activities, as if these opportunities are not already available to racialized children. They are assumed to be citizens in need of improvement. However, this improvement is not achieved through imposition or coercion, but rather through the language of rights and democracy. Every child is entitled to be happy, to be secured. There is also the illusion of the autonomous subject who has the choice to learn or not to learn. Hilmes refers to this as a new rationality of government that is deployed through the civil and political rights of citizenship. Early childhood education serves the principles of multicultural national ideas, creating governable spaces for young racialized children. As these children and their families are reasoned as incomplete, as deviations from the norm, Anglo-American discourses provide the image of the good citizen to which young racialized children and their families are compared. What is not questioned are the normal services, which do not show strong signs of de-racialization from normative and hegemonic whiteness as cultural identity of citizenship and education. Educators see themselves as being flexible, see children as flexible and manageable citizens, and describe themselves as flexible with families in order to help their children adjust in Canada. This flexibility emerged as educators let children and parents adjust to early education environments at their own pace, accommodate their practices and routines of racialized children, and let children take their own time in learning English and improving their language development. Through the deployment of discourses of flexibility, early childhood is responding to the needs of global markets, becoming a zone with citizen subjects with the potential to act in today's global spaces and compete and play the game of global capitalism. Educators who participated in the studies embody the latitudinal citizenship needed in a society of control. They were open to children's circumstances, were flexible in their approaches, continuously adjusted to changing conditions of their environment, and continuously tried to understand the conditions of racialized children. They brought a set of flexible capacities, assets, and potentialities to shape and mold the young racialized children in their care. However, although there is also the possibility that racialized children are made flexible through the constant shaping that the educators performed, this is not to say that racialized children will have equal opportunities to compete in the global market, as the market creates and coordinates diverse possibilities and spaces for different populations, a process that Awell On refers to as graduated citizenship. These spaces and populations are regulated according to the links to global production, often delineated by the interlocking of social formations of gender, race, ethnicity, language, and class. Act number 3, challenging developmentalism. What we fought against through the process of creating the early learning framework in British Columbia were the normative discourses of child development deeply embedded in early childhood. We wanted to challenge the aim of early childhood education shaped within the child study movement of the early 1900s, which goal is to authoritatively know, predict, and assess children to guide them toward maturation and proper humanity with predefined notion of what these are. entangled closely within the desire to guide children's development along a universalized and normalizing trajectory is the concomitant work of correcting and remediating. Children who do not conform to Euro-Western developmental norms are therefore readily positioned as in need of intervention or support, functioning to bound children's lives to unfold only in accordance with a neutral norm. Developmentalism also works to control and erase non-Euro-Western experiences of childhood. This maintains the production of proper humanist subjects, children who have the skills and dispositions to be good citizens by perpetuating structural projects of humanism, neoliberalism, and ongoing settler colonialism. What developmentalism does is to erase and eradicate other possibilities for existence. In other words, it marks ways of living and conceiving childhood that do not ascribe to particular colonial universal as abnormal, undesirable, or expendable. This is the material violence of developmentalism as a universal paradigm for understanding childhood. Developmentalism enacts an ontological violence by restricting the intellectual, embodied, and experiential resources with which we might engage children. That's embedded within structural narratives of normativity and the desire to support children to align with inherited notions of success, academic achievement, and productive adulthood. Developmentalism becomes the only dominant framework that educators are taught. Act number 4, challenging anthropocentrism. In the past decade, I have been working with educators and young children to think about the ways in which education, deeply rooted in humanist and anthropocentric traditions, is directly implicated in our current ecological crisis and in our failure to imagine alternatives. The Cartesian dualisms that structures the unswerving humanist belief that our supreme rationality and the exclusivity of our intentional agency sets us apart from and above the rest of the living world, as Plumwood says, alongside with the associated belief that humans can endlessly act upon the rest of the world with impunity, either to exploit its resources or to improve upon it at will, are at the center of Euro-Western human education and structure our curricular and pedagogies. Education's foundational humanist epistemologies, its delusional human-centric and exceptionalist preoccupations have become part of our problem, not the solution. Despite efforts to promote education as a key to achieving sustainable lives, early childhood centers and other educational institutions continue to prioritize workforce supply for economic growth over planetary sustainability. Humanist-inspired projects to achieve social justice and freedom have been hijacked by economic development and productivity agendas. Capitalist extraction, production, and consumption are closely associated with human progress and development. The fact that the world has the highest number of educated people in its history, and yet it is the nearest to ecological breakdown, is a stark reminder that more of the same kind of education will only compound our problems. Today, my aim is around reconfiguring early childhood curricular and pedagogies in accordance with more than human, collective, and relational notions of agency that create other worlds instead of relying on human ingenuity. So let me see if I can go back. I didn't mean to. All right. So I did the same thing. So my intention has been to trace how Commonwealths pedagogies have been entwined with my intellectual engagement in early childhood. And through this tracing, bring an explicit political intention to Commonwealth pedagogies. Like any education or pedagogical project, Commonwealth in pedagogies can become oppressive and instruments of oppression when aligned with the aims of neoliberalism, of capitalism, of neocolonialism. And we might actually be there. Thus, Commonwealth in pedagogies in British Columbia need to specifically interrogate the conditions of our current times and specifically the self-evidence of its status quo. They need to challenge the patriarchal capitalist tentacles that grasp and feed early childhood education, but they need to do that without having a particular kind of human already defined. The goal for Commonwealth pedagogies, if I have learned something through my work in early childhood education, is that perhaps it is the time for us to rethink how education creates other kinds of humans, other kinds of worlds, rather than continuing to maintain the humanity that we have created. And perhaps I might propose that for me, or that the way that I think about Commonwealth in pedagogies is Commonwealth pedagogies that attend not necessarily knowing already who the human is going to be, but attending to the politics of assembling livable worlds for all, not knowing yet what that human is, what that society will be. But every pedagogy, of course, needs to have some kind of axiology. So what child and for what society? A collective of resisting capitalist neocolonial logics, a human and more than human collective, solidarity amongst the species, world care. What are the methods that we might use? Slowing down, paying attention, thinking with the world's logics that are going against resisting capitalism, focusing on the mundane, on the ordinary, the earthy, and at the same time identifying and grappling with the sticky knots, the tensions, the asymmetries, the thrown up of those relations. Classrooms as a space to experiment with what is not yet here, what could be otherwise. Now, I want to end by returning to bell hooks, this time her final words in Teaching to Transgress. The classroom, with all its limitations, remains a location of possibility. In that field of possibility, we have the opportunity to labor for freedom, to demand of ourselves and our comrades an openness of mind and heart that allows to face reality, even as we collectively imagine ways to move beyond boundaries, to transgress. So the question that I want to pose to early childhood educators in British Columbia and to early childhood education in general is engaging with Commonwealth pedagogies by asking the question, how might we think with this pedagogical project to transgress the humanist project that the early learning framework itself proposes? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Veronica Pacini-Ketchabaw, for your wonderful talk. And right now we have time for questions or comments. You could just unmute yourself and ask a question or make any comments. or enter some text in the chat. So
I'll start. Hi, Veronica. Thank you for your words. During your talk, you talked about your concern with taking up the Commonwealth. One of the concerns that you talked about was depoliticizing, and how Commonwealths have been taken up by a few educators in the field as a solutionized, and how it kind of got in that way morphed into the nature education in that essence of trying to erase a human, or erasing a woman, erasing human in an essence to that stewardship notion. And again, going back to that neoliberal configurement of to think this and then ease it up. And I know that that wasn't your intention, but I have witnessed that a lot in our field, how that has been taken up. And I want to just hear about a little bit more in terms of how you are engaging with that idea. I think I talked to you very briefly about that previously, but yes, still that notion of connecting Commonwealth with nature education, again, easing things down as if it's the curriculum that can be broken down into, and just taking it up as an application.
Yes, Dana, it's like, you know, part of it is also that this is what happens within a capitalist neoliberal space that is constantly appropriating. And I think perhaps I have, you know, the illusion that that shouldn't happen. That's why I don't want to say, you know, this is what they are specifically, but this is how I think about it. I don't know if it's unavoidable for that to take place today in the 21st century, when education is about maintaining the status quo. I think it has happened too quickly. It caught me by surprise how they have been completely depoliticized. Now, you know, we put them out there. What are we going to do? We can't control what happens. That's another part that maybe I should just like, oh, well, you know, Veronica, what do you want? There's no other way. But I think that in general, what concerns me is that we continue to think that that all pedagogy are outside of political aims, outside of political intents. And I don't think that early childhood educators do it because they have bad intentions or anything like that. But I think part of it is like we forget why we are in education. We forget about the political project of subject formation that takes place, and that the goal of when we take Commonwealth in pedagogies, or when we engage in nature education or stewardship, environmental pedagogies, is about maintaining the status quo, maintaining nature culture divides, maintaining human-centric notions of the world, and so on and so forth. I don't know if that answers your question, if that's what you wanted to hear more about. But
yes, that was more so of some of the things that I've been thinking around, as many of my students actually bring up this research and then this theoretical perspective into our work, because I work with BC Early Learning Framework and how that is taken up in, especially in their practicums, when they're thinking with this living inquiry processes, like as if this is something that can be grasped and then applied so easily to loving nature. And so then again, that stewardship notion of it, and then easily become the solutionized way of thinking that I'm a better human being now that I'm thinking about nature. And I think that's heavily like instilled in some way. And that's, again, I think it's quite bit of a whiteness in it, that Western whiteness in it, that there is that certain humans, the 21st human beings, the notion, the norm, the standard of it is that we take care of Earth. Like we need to be vegan, we need to love what we do, we need to recycle. And I'm just being, the reason that I'm sharing is just being mindful of how this Commonwealths idea has been taken up that way, and understanding BC Early Learning Framework that was written in that way, and then it's keep perpetuating yet again that neoliberal sense of taking things up. So yeah, we'll just
yes, absolutely, yes. And that's quite concerning, right? Again, not sure that I can necessarily control it. But I think for me, having this opportunity to go back and trace my own trajectory as to how I work, I think Commonwealth pedagogies, how I have experienced education as a very political space.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thanks, Dana.
Is there any more questions or comment? Okay, so if there are no more questions, so I'm wondering, so whether Dr. Pacini-Ketchabaw have any thing to add before I close today's session?
Well, thank you very much for having me, for being part of this session.
Wonderful. So great. So my thanks to Dr. Veronica Pacini-Ketchabaw again for the very wonderful talk and the intriguing discussions we have. I also want to thank Dr. William Piner and Dr. Anne Phelan for hosting Curriculum Studies in Canada seminar series, and those who make this inspiring and intellectually enriching event possible. I want to thank each of you to attend today's session. And this is the last but not least session of Curriculum Studies in Canada seminar series from 2020 to 2021. You could find our past recorded sessions on the website curriculumstudiesincanada.ca and our YouTube channel. So thank you so much again for your interest and for your great support. Bye-bye.